Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about an international issue. Experts are saying that China has won this trade war. China and the US have reached an agreement. The tariffs the US imposed on China have been reduced to 20%, while the tariffs China imposed on the US, except for energy, have been reduced to 10%. Two major newspapers have said, "Don't believe Trump when he boasts that he succeeded in the negotiations." After the US and Chinese leaders ended their summit in South Korea, US President Trump was quick to announce the results of the meeting. He said that China and the US had reached consensus on almost all issues, and that the US had already reduced the tariffs imposed in response to the fentanyl crisis to 10%, effective immediately. This means that the US tariff rate on Chinese goods has already dropped from 57% to 47%. He also mentioned, almost as if making a formal declaration, that China will begin to purchase large quantities of American soybeans, for which he expressed deep gratitude. Trump highly praised Xi Jinping, calling him a great leader and the great leader of a very powerful country, emphasizing that the entire US-China relationship is extremely important. He considered this meeting to be very successful and also announced that next April he will visit China. That's just how Trump is. He likes to exaggerate and take credit, only talking about things that benefit himself. He didn't mention the concessions made by the US. Later, the spokesperson for the US Department of Commerce made a brief announcement about the consensus reached between China and the US. First, the US will cancel the so-called additional 10% tariffs on Chinese goods, and China will make corresponding adjustments. In response to the US's aforementioned tariff countermeasures, secondly, the US will suspend for 1 year the 50% penetration rule on export controls for Chinese companies that was announced on September 29th. China will also suspend for 1 year the export control measures on rare earths that were announced on October 9th. Thirdly, the US will suspend for 1 year the additional port entry fees imposed on Chinese vessels, and China will likewise suspend its corresponding countermeasures against the US for 1 year. Fourth, both sides have reached a consensus on strengthening cooperation in anti-drug efforts, expanding agricultural trade, and properly resolving issues such as TikTok. The consensus between the two sides is rather complex, and to truly understand what agreements have been reached, we need to first review the entire US-China trade war. Trump took office on the 20th of this year, and then, on February 1st, launched the first wave of the tariff war, citing China's export of fentanyl precursors to the US as the reason, and imposed a 10% tariff on all imported Chinese goods. In response to these so-called fentanyl tariffs, China immediately announced a series of countermeasures, imposing tariffs of 10 to 15% on American imports, such as coal, liquefied natural gas, and crude oil. By March 3rd, Trump began launching the second wave of the tariff war, again using fentanyl as the justification, raising the fentanyl-related tariffs on Chinese goods from the previous 10% to 20%. On the same day, China announced a 15% tariff on American imports such as chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton, and a 10% tariff on soybeans, pork, beef, fruits, vegetables, and so on. This is when China started imposing a 10% tariff on American soybeans. By April 2nd, Trump launched the third wave of actions, imposing so-called reciprocal tariffs on all countries around the world, including China. This included an additional 3% tariff on Chinese goods, bringing the total cumulative tariff to 54%. China immediately retaliated by imposing a 34% tariff on all American goods. As the United States kept escalating, China continued to counter, and both sides raised their respective reciprocal tariffs to 125%. This marked the peak of the China-US trade war. China responded forcefully at every step, refusing to give an inch, and after both sides imposed massive tariffs on each other, trade negotiations resumed in Switzerland starting in May. On May 12th, the two sides reached a first-phase agreement, agreeing to lower their reciprocal tariffs from 125% down to 10%. Of this, about 90% of the tariffs were cancelled, and around 24% were postponed for implementation. At this point, both sides had basically rolled back to the situation before April 2nd, when the US first imposed retaliatory tariffs. Both parties retreated in sync, each retaining a 10% reciprocal tariff. It's important to note that China is one of the only countries in the world that, after the US imposed a 10% reciprocal tariff on Chinese goods, could in turn impose a 10% reciprocal tariff on US goods. According to this agreement, the tariffs that were collected by both sides before April 2nd will still be retained. This means that the US is still imposing a 20% additional tariff on Chinese goods, which includes a 10% reciprocal tariff. In other words, the US is still separately imposing a 20% additional tariff on Chinese goods, and if you add the 10% reciprocal tariff, it means that the current US administration is still imposing a total of 30% tariffs on Chinese goods. Meanwhile, China is still maintaining up to a 15% retaliatory tariff on US energy and agricultural products. If you add the 10% reciprocal tariff, it means that the Chinese government is still imposing a 20 to 25% tariff on US energy and agricultural products. From the Swiss agreement, it's clear that both China and the US are de-escalating and stepping back at the same time, rather than, as Trump claimed, making it seem like only China is making concessions. However, after May, the US made some small moves again, and in September, it imposed so-called head-on measures to sanction Chinese companies. This means that even their subsidiaries, in which they hold a 50% stake, are subject to sanctions against China. Even though China responded in October with a further killer move to restrict rare earth exports, in the end, they were forced back to the negotiating table. Up to today's China-US-South Korea summit, it was ultimately decided not to reduce the 10% fentanyl tariff. What both sides mean is that China and the US are stepping back to the situation before the second wave of US tariffs on March 3rd, so China will also cancel the second wave of retaliatory tariffs, that is, cancel tariffs on US imports like millet and other products. This 15% tariff, along with the removal of the additional 10% tariff on US products like soybeans, was agreed upon at the China-US-South Korea summit. With this step, US soybeans exported to China will only be subject to a reciprocal 10% tariff, which is a relatively low rate. This means China can resume purchasing US soybeans. According to the newly announced plan, the first wave of the US's 10% tariff on Chinese goods, combined with the continued 10% reciprocal tariff, means that the Trump administration has imposed a total of 20% tariffs on Chinese goods. This is similar to the 19% tariffs the US has imposed on most ASEAN countries. As a result, there is no longer an incentive for Chinese factories to relocate to these regions. As for Japanese and South Korean goods, the US has imposed a 15% tariff. Although this is slightly lower than the 20% tariff imposed on China, these two countries have been forced to commit to massive investments in the US, Japan investing $550 billion and South Korea investing $350 billion. In contrast, China has not invested a single cent. Would China ever sign such a humiliating agreement? As for Trump's claim that the tariff rate on Chinese goods will drop from 57% to 47%, in reality, that 47% includes the 27% additional tariffs imposed by the previous Trump administration. He's very good at sleight of hand. After this round of negotiations, he's still keeping a 20% tariff on Chinese goods, and by adding the previous tariffs, he claims it's 47% to exaggerate his own achievements. Of course, Trump didn't mention at all that China has also imposed a comprehensive 10% tariff on American goods, and that American products like coal, liquefied natural gas, and crude oil are still subject to an additional 20 to 25% tariff. With such high tariffs on US energy products, and given how easily these products can be substituted, it will remain very difficult for the US to gain access to the Chinese market in the future. Here's a brief summary. Tariffs on Chinese goods, once higher, are now at 20%. China's tariffs on American products, except energy, have dropped to 10%. Chinese exports to the US still face a 20% tariff. At this rate, since other countries' goods also face similar new US tariffs, pressure on Chinese exports has eased and sustainability has improved. American officials will be busy in the future working towards reaching an agreement with China and are excited about China relaxing its rare earth export controls. However, the New York Times already poured cold water on this optimism as early as Tuesday, December 18th, pointing out that the Trump administration, after a long period, is really just trying to restore US-China relations to roughly the state they were in before the tariff war was initiated. It's just about resolving a crisis that Trump himself created. Even the Times published another commentary on October 30th, stating that Trump not only lost the trade war with China, but after the US-China summit, Trump might brag about his negotiation skills, and his aides might even hint that Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. However, the Times author, Keith Bradshaw, suggests you should just roll your eyes at such claims. According to Keith Bradshaw, when Trump rashly announced the tariff policy in April this year, he seriously misjudged the situation. He seemed to think that China was very vulnerable, believing that China's exports to the US far exceeded its imports. But he clearly didn't realize that the soybeans China buys could easily be sourced from elsewhere, and that in the field of rare earths, China is like OPEC is with oil. The US simply has no alternative sources from which to buy rare earths, while China controls 90% of the world's rare earth production and is the sole supplier of 6 types of heavy rare earths. At the same time, China holds a dominant position in the rare earth magnet market. Without access to these rare earth resources, some American factories would be forced to shut down, and military suppliers would also be severely affected. For example, a single submarine requires 4 tons of rare earths. It is entirely foreseeable that China would turn its control over rare earths into a weapon in international disputes. The US was thus forced to return to the negotiating table with China just a few weeks ago and reach an agreement. On the surface, it looks like things have reverted to the pre-trade war situation, but in reality, it seems more like the US initiated the conflict and then suddenly surrendered, putting itself in an even weaker position. This is because, in this dispute, it seems that China is using its control over rare earths as a weapon, wielding it as a long-term tool to pressure the US President Xi would agree to suspend rare earth controls for a year, which would be a clever move, retaining leverage over the US without causing too much chaos that might force the US and other countries to break China's near monopoly in the rare earth sector. At a weekend meeting about rare earths, Jess said to everyone in the room, the expert posed a question, asking everyone to raise their hands to indicate their stance. Who believed the US would win this trade war, who thought China would win, and who felt it was still too early to tell who would come out on top? The vast majority believed that China held the upper hand and was likely to win. Now, Trump has already forced China to use rare earths as a weapon, but the US simply has no way to quickly find alternative sources. Lynch, the CEO of a major Canadian mining company specializing in metals expansion, told them that developing rare earth production capacity would require a large-scale effort on the level of the Manhattan Project. Even if they went all out like that, it could still take 5 to 7 years before any results would be seen. Lynch said that during this period, the US would have no choice but to reach agreements with China. In fact, after the trade war, Trump quickly realized that China could swiftly retaliate against the US trade bully with tariffs and other measures, unexpectedly putting the US in a bullied position. As a result, he began to appease China and make concessions. This is exactly the kind of situation that raises concerns for the US in the coming years. He said that Xi Jinping has clearly seen through America's weaknesses and recognized his own advantages in their bilateral relationship, especially if it becomes clear that Trump is the kind of weak leader who will compromise under pressure. Moreover, since Trump has betrayed and offended America's allies, these countries are unlikely to cooperate with the US in confronting China. He said that President Xi would suspend rare earth restrictions for a year, but he would not allow the US to build up a rare earth reserve. It will likely become more difficult, or to put it more fairly, more challenging, for every company to obtain rare earths for manufacturing fighter jets and submarines. In this regard, Xi Jinping is probably just giving the US a taste of its own medicine, since the US has treated China the same way when it comes to semiconductors. He said that back in 2008, China's great military strategist Sun Wu wrote the following in The Art of War. To win 100 battles out of 100 is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. This may very well be Xi Jinping's calculation, that China can use rare earths to gain new trade leverage and, without firing a single missile, strengthen its military influence in the Western Pacific. President Xi is very likely, either explicitly or implicitly, to use the threat of restricting rare earth exports to push Trump to reduce support for Taiwan or scale back patrols in the South China Sea. Therefore, when you hear Trump and his aides come out and announce a so-called milestone agreement with China, don't be too quick to cheer. Americans may not only lose a trade war, but in the coming years could also forfeit a great deal of global credibility and influence. This will be seen by the world as a sign of America's decline. If the Financial Times assessment of the United States is already so good, there's really not much I can add, except to say that China has indeed won this trade war through its own strength.